Abortion happens every day. Millions of people around the world will have an abortion each year. But the majority of those people will never talk about their abortion experiences. What if millions of people broke their silence and told the truth about their lives and their choices? This is Melissa Madera in Dublin, Ireland, and you're listening to the Abortion Diary podcast. These are the stories we share. I'll be in Dublin, Ireland until June 17th. If you'd like to share your story, please contact me at melissa@theabortiondiary.com.
I should preface the actual story of the abortion by saying that I got pregnant whenever I was 18 in my first year in the summer holidays before I went to university, and had always been really pro-life, and still looking back now don't understand why I didn't get an abortion then. But I went ahead and had the child, possibly some kind of guilt thing. I do remember thinking, well, it's not the baby's fault. And looking back now, it's ridiculous. It wasn't a baby at the time. Like, I was about 11 weeks pregnant when I made that final decision. So I had a child then, who is now 19. I didn't stay with his father, but I met the man I'm married to now. And about a year after we got married, we decided to try and get pregnant. And I got pregnant very quickly, but the first time I had a miscarriage at 11 weeks. I immediately got pregnant again, and that one was I asked for an early scan because I just wanted to feel secure and know that I wasn't going to have a miscarriage again. So they gave me a scan at 7 weeks, and the heartbeat was perfectly fine. So they said if there's a really good heartbeat at 7 weeks, then you're probably not going to miscarry. So everything was fine. 12-week scan showed everything was perfect as well. And then at 16 weeks, I went in to have a test which showed up the likelihood of things like Spina Bifida and Down syndrome. That was at 16 weeks. And the following week, I was going to Oslo with my husband on holidays. And while I was in Oslo, I was getting phone calls on my phone, but I wasn't answering anything unless it was something to do with my mother who was looking after my son or whatever. So I didn't answer phone calls that were coming up from strange numbers. I didn't think anything of them. And then whenever I got home, I was about 18 weeks pregnant by that stage. After a few days home, I got a phone call from the hospital telling me that my risk of having a child with spina bifida looked higher than normal, and they just wanted me to go in and get a scan to see if the child was affected. Now, although I kind of panicked and spent 2 days Googling or whatever, they said in the vast majority of cases there is no spina bifida, it's just raised hormone levels. I spent 2 days between hearing and going to the appointment just Googling every single thing about these tests, and I was fine. I went in by myself. I didn't even bring my husband, so sure was I that everything would be okay. And so when I went into the hospital, the doctor, a man called Dr. Ong, he did the scan for me. And as he was looking at it, I could see him being very concerned, and he was an obstetrician, etc. And he just turned around to me and said, "This isn't a normal baby." And we just started explaining it was definitely spina bifida. He said it was reasonably serious spina bifida. He said the child's head was shaped like a lemon, signs that the child would probably be, and like this changes the story on further on, but the child would be mentally fine, and in that way the child would be completely normal, but that the child would have to be in a wheelchair forever and would be incontinent forever. So it was completely physical, which I think made the whole thing harder later on, because you really were just, in my mind, it wouldn't have been the same as having an abortion at 12 weeks when I don't really believe that as a baby. So I just kind of was in shock. And he said to me, well, you have two choices. You can either have an abortion, and he said, in which case you'll have to go to England because it's illegal to have an abortion here, or you can go ahead and have the baby and we'll support you, etc. So I phoned my husband and told him to come over to the hospital. And when I put down the phone, I just said to the doctor, I just know I want a termination. It wasn't even a hard decision. I just knew immediately that I didn't want to have the baby. So he said, right, okay, we had to go into another room and start discussing all the aspects of it. He had to make sure I was completely in full knowledge of everything that would be wrong with the baby as far as he could see. He told me about the rule in Northern Ireland, which is that you have to go to England and you need the consent of 2 doctors before you do it. And everything that he was saying at this stage suggested to me that I would have to go to England. So he sent me home and said that in 2 days I was to come in for a fuller scan and everything, and I had to think about it when I was at home. I knew that I didn't have to think about it. I knew exactly what I wanted. He told me that one of the reasons that, fetal abnormality isn't an acceptable, valid reason for an abortion in Northern Ireland either. It would have to be that my health was at risk. And he said the only way your health could be at risk was if you were to suffer mental health wise from this. And I remember saying, well, I just can't pretend to be suicidal. I said, if it comes down to me having to pretend to be suicidal, it's never going to happen. I'm just not that type of person. I couldn't even pretend to be. I said, it won't make me suicidal if I have the child. I just really don't want to have the child. So when I went home, I started Googling away as well and looking at the prices and flights and looking at clinics, etc. And it was a Thursday I'd found out. I phoned my mummy the next day and told her that there was a problem with the placenta and that the baby was probably going to die. And she said she would come up that evening. And I brought my aunt round to the house that evening. And my aunt's very liberal and, had always bought me copies of Our Bodies, Ourselves. And she's a real feminist and big abortion campaigner here. And I told her the full story. And she said, right, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm definitely going to have it. I've been online. I've been checking to make sure. I actually went out that night and got really drunk. And sitting in the bar. At this stage, I was 19 weeks pregnant. I was 20 weeks pregnant, actually, by the time the whole thing came around. So I had a noticeable bump. I just remember thinking, I don't even care that people notice. I'm not having the baby anyway. That, to me, that showed that I'd already made my decision. The baby moved around a lot. And that first night when I went to bed, my husband had to go up to my aunt's house and get Valium. I just said, I can't have this baby moving around inside me. I really started to hate it. It was making me feel sick. It wouldn't stop moving. And the next morning, my husband phoned up the hospital and said, look, can we come in now for this scan or whatever it is that you need to see if you're going to give consent to go to England? And the doctor said, we can't bring it forward anymore. But he said, what we can tell you is that she can probably have the procedure in the hospital, which was a huge relief to me, even though I knew that I still had to wait a couple more days to actually go in. The stress of having to go to England, it was going to cost me about £2,500 overall, which was fine for me in that I had that money sitting there in savings, but the desperation of needing £2,500, I can't imagine how people have to go through that. Obviously, it was so traumatic that starting to book flights and hotels and everything, I just can't even imagine what would have happened. It was a huge relief that he said that. And whenever I went in, he gave me the full scan. I went in the next day. He actually said to my husband on the phone, tell her to pack an overnight bag. And when she's coming in, if everything is the same in the scan, and he said they had to do another scan to make sure, and they had to show it to somebody else and get a second opinion, that if everything was the same, and I was sure that they would bring on labour that day. I had to go into labour because at this stage the baby I was 20 weeks pregnant as far as I knew, but they said that by this, even my son was very big as well, so the baby could have just been big, but that it looked between 20 and 21 weeks. So the only way to actually have the abortion was to give birth. And the doctor himself was amazing. We had the scan. He took pictures. He laid all the details out in front of me. I still think I have the details somewhere now because I always mean to hide them in case my son finds them sometime, because I'll probably never tell him. And there was an opening at the back of the baby's spine, which meant that it would definitely be in a wheelchair. And he said, however, there is no mental retardation. It's completely physical. And he said, you can just decide now to have this abortion now. He said, we've got a bed for you up in the maternity ward. and in a room of my own, obviously. And he said, we will induce labour later on today. He said it could take the next 24 hours, but you would just have to give birth to the baby. And I mean, it was the only way I was going to be able to do it anyway, even if I went to England, because it was so far on. So I just went up to the hospital, or up to the ward that evening, and they gave me whatever it is in the drip that induced the labour, and I went into labour. For a painkiller, they gave me pethidine, which is kind of the painkiller now that people don't take in labour, because it's like opium. It was doolally, the whole thing. Well, I didn't ask for that then when I was giving birth to my son, because I wanted to know what was happening. But every 4 hours I got them to up my dose of pethidine because of the severe pain of being induced, but also because I was in this high. It was like, I still remember Heroes, the TV programme that had started that night, being on and me watching it and feeling. I remember saying to my husband, I understand now why people used to lie around in opium dens. The whole thing was like it wasn't happening, because the painkillers were just, I was totally morphined out of my mind. So the nurses were fantastic. They were so lovely, and the doctor himself came in and checked on me. There was not an element of judgment at all, and I will say that. And the reason that things changed in Northern Ireland is a few years after this happened, the laws were tightened to mean that doctor, he was taking a risk at the time, but it was one of those brushed underneath the carpet things. Everyone knew that the doctors did it, but the rules have been tightened so much now that the doctors will no longer even do that. They have no choice but to send you to England. And so I just went through the labour. I went to sleep that night. Every time the pain got really bad, they came and gave me more morphine, and my husband was given a bed in the place. He went to sleep in a bed in the same room as me. And then about 5 o'clock in the morning, I went to the toilet and just felt something change when I was sitting on the toilet. And I went in and I said, I think I'm going to have the baby now. And the midwives came in and checked around and said, yes, I think, over the next half hour, the baby's going to come out. I remember saying, I asked my husband to leave the room. I didn't want to give birth in front of him. I don't know why that happened. He was there obviously whenever I did give birth to my son the following year, but I just asked him to go, and so he left at that stage. And then the midwife stayed with me until, and it wasn't like, because the baby was so small, it sounds awful, but it just really, the contractions that I could hardly feel had obviously just been pushing it out, and it just like slithered out. And I remember saying, is it dead? I just remember thinking, I hope it's dead. They didn't say anything actually at that, so I still don't know if perhaps, at 21 weeks or 20 to 21 weeks, it could have been alive for a little while. So that was fine. They took the baby away, and I didn't really know what would happen after that. They showed it to me, but I don't remember seeing it. My husband came back into the room, and he was really upset then because they'd shown it to him, and this was his first child, and I don't really think he thought of it as a baby until he actually saw it, just because he wasn't as immersed obviously in the whole experience as me. And then they came in afterwards and said that they were going to take photographs of it, and that did I want the photographs? And I said, no, I don't want any photographs. And they said, well, we keep photographs of them all anyway, because we, for our records, keep details of all these things that have happened. And I said, well, maybe in a couple of months I'll want to see the photographs, and didn't really think on that again. But I went back to sleep for a while, and when I woke up, the nurse came in and she said, look, you can leave anytime, you can stay for the rest of the day, but you can leave anytime. But she said, we've left the baby in, there was a wee room next door, which they left it in there. So my husband went in to see it, and he came in and he was actually crying at this stage. And I didn't realise they did this, but they actually dressed the baby in clothes. They had put a tiny baby grow on it, and they'd put it in like a wee basket. And it was the most, I said I don't want to see it, but when I was leaving, I said, just before I leave, I'll go in and see it. It was the most traumatic thing I've ever seen. It made me realise that having an abortion is fine to me if I don't think of it as a baby. And that was the first time even though I'd felt it moving and everything, still only then when I actually thought to myself, they should ask people if they want the baby dress. I'm sure they just do it out of respect, but they told me that the baby would be. And I mean, I think of it as a baby now. I didn't give it a name, and afterwards people always said to me, did you give it a name? But I didn't want to call it the name that I had chosen for a baby, because I actually wanted to call my son that. But then I didn't want to kind of just palm it off with any old name, so I just didn't name it at all. While this was going on, obviously my family had been contacting me loads. I told my mummy eventually. At the beginning I told her that the baby was going to die anyway. And then over the next few weeks I told her the truth, that it was Spina Bifida. I told my sister eventually. Most people, apart from my husband and those two, it's only in about the past year I've told anyone the truth. I told everyone that it was a placental problem. My daddy still thinks that. I still wouldn't tell him. And while they're Catholics, they don't go to Mass. They're not very strict Catholics. My mother probably doesn't really believe it all, actually. But my father is quite judgmental about things, and I just prefer he didn't know. The other thing is that I can't decide whether it's better, I don't know what I mean by better, but in terms of people's moral judgment, that I did it because I had the valid excuse of having a child with a fetal abnormality. I can't decide whether that's better or worse, because in my case I aborted a planned baby, and I always think people have that attitude where, well, you should love your child regardless. You know, you can't choose. I can't decide whether they would think it was a bigger sin, if you like, to abort. And I don't believe in sin, but again, it's one of those things that you think about all the time. I can't decide whether it's a bigger sin to abort a perfectly healthy child just because you don't want it, or one that you actually really wanted but who isn't healthy. And I think that's still the thing I think about sometimes. So I went home. I mean, I was off work for about 2 months, but because the hospital told me just to stay off as long as they said that they wouldn't send a woman back before 10 weeks after having a baby, and because I'd gone through labour, they said it wasn't just the same as the previous miscarriage, I just needed a D&C. I didn't really like meeting people for the first while afterwards, because I had to start explaining the whole situation to them, and I probably overcompensated because I'd had an abortion by immediately saying, look, did you hear what happened to the baby? Because one week I had a bump and the next week I didn't. My husband went through all our photographs from Oslo and deleted all the pictures of me with a bump, because he was so scared that I would see them and be upset. And I was really upset then when I found out that he'd done it. I had to go back in 6 weeks later to talk to a consultant, like a follow-up thing, just that you do 6 weeks after having a baby anyway. And, you know, she asked me how I was feeling, did I regret it, things. I've never ever regretted it, you know, and it really annoys me when you see pro-life campaigners saying so many women have mental health issues after an abortion. You know, the most dangerous thing you can do for your mental health is have a baby. And the chances of suffering from mental health after an abortion is nowhere near the chances of suffering from mental health after having a baby. I mean, it's the worst excuse ever. And I've never met anyone who had an abortion and regretted it. I was probably a bit weepy for a while afterwards, but I don't think about it very much now either. I got pregnant a year later. Not even a year later. I had a baby a year later. I got pregnant after a month after it, even though the doctor said I probably shouldn't try. But that really helped. So by the time I was 3 months pregnant, it was about 4.5 months since the termination, and that just kind of made me forget about it. I really did then just stop thinking about it very much. The odd time now I think about it, just because I think about the age of the child. If I see children in wheelchairs, we have a really clever girl in school who is in a wheelchair because she's got spina bifida. I mean, 10 A stars GCSE student. And I think, you know, what would life have been like? But I also know we stopped after having one child because my eldest son now lives by himself. He's 19 and he's moved out. And we have a lifestyle that suits one child. You know, we do go away a lot. We travel quite a lot. We go out quite a lot. You know, as a couple, we're very independent of each other, going places. And it sounds really callous as well, but our lifestyle would be very, very different if we had had a child who was in a wheelchair for the rest of its life. I don't know if we would have stayed together even, in that, you know, I think it's very hard to stay together anyway. You know, we're married 10 years now, but I think that would have made it very difficult for us. I think it would have had a huge impact on my other son, who was 11 when my son, who's now 7, was born. Any families I know with a disabled child, the other children really do suffer. It's a full-time job to do. I can't imagine we could both be working full-time. I can't imagine I would have liked giving up my job. I don't even, when people go down to 4 days and stuff, I even think it's strange. I was never the type of person who would have stayed home and looked after a child. I took a year off maternity, and then I went back to work, and I'm not hugely ambitious in work, but I do love working. And even in saying all this, it sounds like I'm trying to justify it, but I don't. I actually genuinely don't even feel the need to justify it. I suppose it's just all of the reasons that I did it in the first place. But I didn't have to actually sit and weigh it up. The minute the doctor told me that, I just was able to say immediately with full knowledge, yes, I want a termination. And I'm very happy about that. I think people who suffer guilt and who think about it an awful lot were people who actually found it difficult to make the decision in the first place. And I knew immediately and have never, ever regretted it. Well, I had been pro-life until I was about 15 or 16, in that kind of, I went to a Catholic school. We were shown videos of people giving birth, and I think I was actually in Life or something for a few, but I think lots of teenagers go through that phase where they're very black and white about this is a baby, killing it's murder. So by the time I went to university, I was pro-choice in that I thought other people should be able to do it. But when it actually came to doing it myself, I look back now and I just don't understand why I had a child when I was 19. I just can't fathom. If that was now, 100%, if that was my daughter, I would say immediately have an abortion. And I think there were times, I remember at the time saying, you could really regret having an abortion, but you're never going to regret having a child. And there are times I have actually thought, yes, I do regret having a child. It shaped the rest of my life and the choices that I made and everything. So ironically, I don't now. I mean, he's lovely now, but when I was a single mother and things were very hard, and when I had met my new husband and he wasn't the easiest teenager, I had a very bad relationship with his father. There were times I thought, actually, I was very stupid not to do it then. And then ironically, I had to do it whenever it was a planned child later on.
What do you think changed the doctor's mind?
I don't think the doctor did change his mind. I think that because he was in fact technically doing something illegal, I think in the first instance, before a woman's really sure, I think the first thing they do is to cover themselves, always say, well, abortion is illegal here. Because it was secret, it was illegal. He was doing it secretly. And I think that that's the first thing they say in all cases when that happens. You have to go to England. I think then when he saw how serious I was about it and everything, whenever he was saying it would need to affect your mental health, I said, look, I am an educated woman. I know what I'm talking about. I'm making this decision. I'm informed, and it's just part of me thinks that's what they always say. That's what they always said at the time. And only then, whenever you had made your decision and everything, did they say, right, well, we can actually do it here. Because every time they did it, it was kind of putting their career in danger. If somebody had decided to do something about it, they could have. Although I've heard from people that it did happen on a regular basis, but no one really knew about it.
Did doctors get arrested?
Now they can actually be arrested. Then they could have been struck off for doing it, but it was kind of ignored. Whereas then the law was tightened up because of the DUP, as far as I know. It was tightened up a few years later, and they could effectively, just like that poor woman who was arrested and charged recently for the abortion pill, they can be put in prison for up to 14 years. So, I mean, you just wouldn't expect somebody to do that. You can only be so altruistic. I met that doctor actually with his wife. He was married to one of the midwives, and they had a baby in the trolley in the supermarket. I met them one day, and I just thought, I mean, those people are brilliant, the men and women who do that over there, but it's not actually legal, just because they were making a moral decision to help somebody. But now it's actually, I think it's up to 14 years in prison. that's the same with a woman who gives herself an abortion, or who they can be put in prison for up to 14 years, which is the equivalent of murder. And everyone was in Northern Ireland was horrified recently whenever Donald Trump said that thing about, yes, women should be punished for having abortions. I was incredulous. I said, that's the exact same here. You can go to prison for 14 years. Now, it's never happened, but it's still there and it could happen. And it became more likely when that woman was charged for the pills recently. And I mean, she had, her friends had gone and reported her. Her flatmates had gone and reported her for it. And, and that's another thing. You just don't know here who, when you're saying something, how people think about things. It's another reason for watching who you say things to, because that just shocked me. And the reason they give was not that they were actually pro-life, but that they were annoyed she didn't show any remorse for it at all. And I just thought people have such warped ways of thinking that, a lot of the time you're better off just not saying things to people. I have a very liberal group of friends though, but in Northern Ireland I would say that is quite Belfast centric, and once you go outside it, well, if you see how many people vote for the parties who are in, there's obviously an awful lot of people who are very pro-life, homophobic, all those kind of things as well. We still can't get gay marriage in here either. I mean, I genuinely don't even the way I was talking about that as a baby was only because it was an actual baby sitting in front of me. I genuinely don't believe that. I mean, I think that the religions that believe in the pre-quickening, that before that it's fine, I think that's much more sensible and rational. And I think people get very emotional about something that is in no way a baby. It's like Emma wrote an article for The Guardian recently and said, comparing a 12-week-old fetus to my niece and nephew is the same as comparing a ball of wool to a jumper. And it was criticised a lot in the media for saying that, but I genuinely believe that as well. That there is a minute when life begins, and it's a very difficult thing to define when that is, but it's certainly not that early in a pregnancy, especially not when you have to weigh it up with the fact that there's a real woman, very often with other kids, and it's certainly not more important on any hierarchy than her or the children she already has.
What do you think was the catalyst for you moving from pro-life to pro-choice at 15, 16, 17?
I think it was just growing up and having more sense and losing sentimentality that I had whenever I was a teenager. I started having sex and using contraception, and I always think teenagers, I teach in a Catholic school and could never be very pro-choice in actively when I'm talking to them, but I'm never pro-life when I'm talking to them either, and very often I say every teenager is one pregnancy scare away from changing from being pro-life to being pro-choice. And that never happened to me, but people at school did start having babies and things, and I think it really was just a growing up the reality of having children, compared to the kind of we romanticize mothers, and probably I was a big reader and everything as well. The more you read, the more you see what's happening in the world, the more you think about things. So I don't think there was any big eureka moment where I changed. I just think it was the natural process of growing up, seeing friends from school have children and be saddled with them, and that sounds really harsh, but missing out on an awful lot because they were pro-choice. And it's at that age, I think you make that decision at that age because you realise it's such a life changer for women and you can't go back on it. It's a very permanent thing, which I don't think people really appreciate whenever they're younger.
Earlier you also said that you would never tell your son about this abortion experience. Why?
I don't know. And I probably will tell him that I was pregnant and I was pregnant before him, but I won't say that it was a termination. I will say that something else happened My other son, as far as he knows, that the baby just died as well. So I probably will tell him that, in that among all the stuff, there's scan pictures and things as well. And the only thing I was thinking about earlier on when I said that is that there's a sheet of paper with all the kind of deformities listed on it. I had to sign and everything. And I don't know. It is still that thing that you still think it's an immoral decision that you've made. So yes, I don't believe that it's murder or all of those things that are talked about, but I still understand why women don't really tell anyone. And actually it was just from sitting down with friends with Emma one night, and one of them was talking about, they had done this thing in the newsletter where they'd all signed their names saying that they had helped women get abortions, or one of those arrest us all if you're going to arrest this other woman. And it was just then that they were talking about having abortions, and I said, yeah, I had one as well. It was the first time I ever started talking about it. And then there was a Guardian article that I participated on as well, and the more I told people, the more people said, that's brilliant, you should tell more people about that. And then I thought, the reason we feel guilty about it or we don't say is because we think no one else does. And I think that is why now I've become much more open to the extent of actually wanting to tell the story. Because if people don't, then you're always going to have somebody sitting, especially if the statistics are true, that it's 1 in 3, 1 in 4 women, all feeling like no one else has done it and that they're really guilty.
So then why do you think it is that you would never tell your children?
I don't know. Because, well, maybe when they're older and they're adults, but I still think to children and teenagers, once you, like when I had a miscarriage the first time at 11 weeks, my 11-year-old son was really upset because a baby had died. And the miscarriage at 11 weeks was because no baby had even transformed in the first place. It was just one of those ones where it didn't develop properly. But he was really upset because it had been a baby from the minute I suggested I was pregnant. So perhaps when they were older, like my husband was married before. We haven't told my child that either. And I was saying to him the other day, we should really mention that, just in case he thinks we're trying to hide it from him. We're really not. It's just never come up in conversation. So that kind of thing, I wouldn't want him to think that he'll find photographs or something someday, but I would actively go out of my way to not say that for years. And I don't know why. Still some kind of judgment. Children up to a certain point always think abortion is murder. They just do, because they see that the minute you get pregnant, you're having a baby. And we still do talk about it as that. She's having a baby. She's expecting a baby, as opposed to even pregnant. And so for children, that's what they see in their mind. And I suppose to me, I would still think they would see it as some kind of killing of their brother or sister. Brother, it was a wee boy.
Do you think you will share this story more often?
Yes, I've already started doing it. Except for very conservative people who work along with me, or members of my family. I mean, a few members. My aunt is a midwife who's been working in England her whole life, and I told her and this is what was so different. She just said, in England, that story is just so common. She said, we don't hide it. She actually said whenever she diagnoses someone as being pregnant, whenever she has a positive pregnancy test, the first thing she has to do is say, well, you have 3 options. You can have an abortion, you can keep the baby, or you can get it adopted. And she said, in lots of cases, we're planned children, she has to say that. It's just the first thing they say. Whereas here, it's not even considered, and therefore a shock. So the more I talk to people about it, the more I realise most people think like we do. But that's most people in a small circle of quite liberal friends. So I still wouldn't tell a lot of people at school. And then whenever I did the thing in The Guardian and I sent it to my friend, I never told her, my best friend, either. She said, why did you not tell me this? And I said, well, you're married with children, you seem quite conservative. Knowing that she isn't, she's an educated woman, she's a dentist. But it's amazing how conservative you think people are, or how worried you are about what they're going to think of you. Whereas I also think now, getting older, I worry less about what people think about me anyway. So perhaps that's another added element to it. I don't mind talking about it as much.
Why do you want to share your story?
Because of the fact that the more I talk about it, the more I find out it's happened to lots of other people. And I think the whole guilt thing that's happened in Northern Ireland, I think I'm just reinforcing that by not talking about it. And in a way, condoning what is happening with political parties who are not allowing it to happen. And the fewer people who actually speak up and say that it's happened, and show that they are in no way embarrassed about it or feel guilty about it. I mean, I can understand why it is an upsetting thing, and it's what annoys me about the people who say, well, sure, if we legalise it, it'll just be used as contraception. You know, nobody decides to use abortion as contraception, ever. Those are the kind of arguments that are being used at the minute against decriminalising it in Northern Ireland. And I just think more people need to talk about it to get rid of that idea, that stigma. And I mean, even at the minute, that's used as a reason for people going to England. Well, sure, they can just go and get an abortion. You know, it costs you £2,000. It's really traumatic. No one uses it as contraception, and yet we're still hearing that all the time. You know, I would go, there are political parties who think that it should be brought in the case of fetal abnormality or in the case of danger to the mother. I would go so far as extending it to the 1967 Abortion Act, which is pretty much abortion on demand. If you've got two doctors who, you know, say that you're healthy enough to go through it, etc. And I know lots of pro-choice people don't want to go that far, but I don't think there should be exceptions. I think if you don't want to have a baby, you shouldn't have to have a baby.
As always, for more information about the Abortion Diary podcast, visit us on the web at theabortiondiary.com or email me with your questions or comments. If you would like to share your story, send me an email at melissa@theabortiondiary.com or visit our website, click on Share Your Abortion Story and fill out our contact form. If you're a fan of the podcast and would like to help us reach more folks, please subscribe on iTunes and write a review or rate this podcast. Your reviews and ratings will help us grow in the iTunes rankings and reach more people. I would also love to hear from you. You can also follow The Abortion Diary on Twitter or Facebook. And The Abortion Diary can't continue without your support. Support The Abortion Diary by making a tax-deductible donation to us on Fractured Atlas, or buying some of our wristbands or totes on Store Envy. And a special thanks to you for listening. I'll be back next week with a new story. New stories are posted every Tuesday.